Hello, I'm Dion Hood from Bradford Libraries, and usually from March to June each year, the annual Read Regional campaign would celebrate selected new books from the north of England, and we'd usually be holding author events in our libraries. But obviously, we've had to move our talks and meet the authors online. So today we've got Linda Green, who's going to be telling us about her book, The Last Thing She Told Me. So hello, Linda.
Hi dear, hello. Thank you for the welcome. And I'm sorry not to be there in person. It would have been lovely, but this is the best we've got at the moment. So at least I can be there that way. Yes. So yeah, I was going to say I was really delighted that the last thing she told me was selected for Read Regional. I think the really special thing for me about it is that it's the books are actually selected by librarians, which is a big shout out for librarians now, which is great because I'm a passionate believer in our libraries, and I think, librarians do an amazing job recommending books, and they're so knowledgeable through, all their reading and word of mouth recommendations. So it's lovely that they felt they wanted to give share the last thing she told me more widely, really. And certainly my interest in books and my love affair with reading and then writing started in libraries. I came from a working class household where neither of my parents had a novel in the house, so I didn't grow up in a house full of books. But what they did do is they took me to the local library, and I grew up with piles of books that I would bring home from the library, as many as I can. I always went to my absolute maximum and pour through them at home and look forward to taking them back next week to get some more. And obviously at school, doing that as well. And that's where my love of reading developed. So, and another reason why I'm passionate about the importance of libraries, first of all, everyone in society can access books. So with the last thing she told me, perhaps if I just start a little bit by talking about my career and how I got to the point where I was going to write the next book, and then I'll tell you a little bit about the book itself and my writing process. All authors are different on this, but it's just to explain how I go about the business. So I say my career started, I was determined to be an author and get that book published from when I was about 9 years old was I first said I wanted to be an author. But I also was wise enough to realise that you can't just leave school and become an author. So I was fascinated. I just wanted to earn my living from writing. I was interested in news and current affairs. So I decided to become a journalist. And I went to journalism college and then joined my local newspaper. I lived in North London at that time as a trainee reporter, and spent 10 years in regional newspapers in London and then in Birmingham and Coventry in the Midlands. And it was a fascinating time. I absolutely loved my time in journalism. And I think mainly for me, it's the variety of people that it allowed me to meet and interview. And people often say when they ask about having a background in journalism, does that help with your writing? And it maybe doesn't help you writing to an enormous extent because it's a very different discipline, writing 250 quick news story to writing 100,000 words over a year. It's a very, very different discipline. But what it has hugely helped with is my understanding of people, my insight, particularly a lot of my novels tend to be on quite gritty subjects. I write psychological thrillers and family dramas. And essentially what I'm often doing as a writer is effectively throwing a hand grenade into people's lives and seeing how they cope with it, because so many books, dramas that we watch are like that. And as a journalist, a lot of my time was spent interviewing people who had that happen to them in real life, really. And I interviewed people who had amazing, brilliant experiences, but more often than not, also really tragic and traumatic experiences that they'd dealt with and coped with in a variety of ways. And that was a really good grounding for my career as an author, and that insight into people's lives and how they cope in extraordinary, difficult circumstances is something I've been able to draw on again and again with that. So after 10 years in journalism, the desire to write a book has becoming a bit overwhelming. I didn't have children at that stage, and we had a small mortgage on a small house. And I thought, if it doesn't happen now, it's never going to happen. So I did the thing they tell you never to do. I quit the day job to write my first novel. And I would now say, never quit your day job to write your first novel, because as much as in my head I didn't think it would take that long, the reality was it took 7 years. And I had 102 rejections from agents along the way. Now, I was freelancing as a journalist at the time, so I was doing that sort of part-time to keep the money coming in and spending the rest of the time writing. But it was really difficult to get that first book deal. And the rejections are, whichever way you dress them up, however positive you try to be, there comes a point where it's really hard to keep going, and you do doubt if you're ever going to get there. I'm really proud of the fact that I persevered. Probably I'm a little bit, unhinged to have done that. Certainly after, when you get to 100 and then you carry on, I think you've got to say no sane person would do that. But it was my lifetime's ambition to be an author, and I just didn't want to give it up, and I wanted to keep going. And I felt I was learning all the time. I was getting very good responses from agents. 10 out of the 100 had asked to see the full manuscript. What you usually do is send off 3 chapters, and then if they like it, they ask for the full manuscript. So I was getting that sort of kind of 10% hit rate, thinking, well, I'm not far away, but there were kept being reasons why they didn't think it was quite right. And I ended up writing a second novel, because one agent took me on the first novel and then couldn't get a publisher for it, so asked me to write a second novel. When I delivered that second novel, my son was 2 weeks overdue at that point. So I think I hang on for him. And somewhere in the fog of new motherhood, I had an email from the agent saying, actually, I preferred the first novel, so I'm going to have to let you go. So I was back to square one, really. Now, fortunately, I had a baby to take my mind off it and take up my time. But when he was about 9 months old, I sort of came up for air and thought, what am I going to do? I rewrote that first novel. Sorry, I rewrote the second novel I'd written, sent it off back to the very first agents I tried with the first one. And one of them offered me a deal. He wanted to take me on, and managed to get me a 2-book deal with Headline, who were my first publishers. And that was the start of my writing career. So it was kind of a long and tortuous road. I learned a huge amount along the way, which has stood me in good stead ever since. And I'm now, the last thing she told me was book number 9. So it has felt like a long road, but one that I've thoroughly enjoyed every step of the way. So when it came to writing the last thing she told me, I'd written by that stage 2 books which were sort of known as psychological thrillers, emotional dramas, that type of thing. And it felt like it was the right thing to do. And sometimes with my books, the idea comes from all sorts of places. Very often they're little bits of real life, perhaps something going on in the news, and it's a matter of putting all the pieces together, rather like a jigsaw puzzle. And I think for this book, well, there were 2 things. One was a real life event, and one was something happening in the news that kind of came together. And the real life event was that my 92-year-old grandmother passed away. She'd gone into a home for the last few months of her life, and we knew the time was near. I wasn't there. She lives down in North London, where I'm from originally, but my parents and my sister were with her. And just before she died, she said, or she basically told them somewhere to look to find something which she wanted them to find. And they didn't even get a chance to ask a further question as to what do you mean and what is it actually that we're looking for, because she sadly passed away. And it was a few weeks later, after the funeral, when they were starting to go through her house, that they thought, we really ought to follow, that up. They obviously wondered what it was. And they found, her directions, they found the thing that she'd said, which, without going into too much details, was essentially clearly something that she'd made to remember a loss. There were no words, there was nothing to say what it was that she was remembering, who she was remembering, but it was there. And it was obviously important to her because it was the last thing that she said. And it made me think about particularly that generation of women who so often had kept secrets, had often taken them to their grave, had been made to feel ashamed by society. And I think I remembered watching the film Philomena, if anybody's watched it, about the story of the Magdalene laundry girls in Ireland and how they had to give away their babies. And I told a few close friends about what had happened, and they were all fascinated by it and couldn't stop thinking about it. And that's always a sign for me that you're onto something, when people are fascinated by it. And at the same time, the Me Too movement was beginning around the world, and younger generations of women were talking about the secrets they'd been forced to keep. And finally, feeling that they finding the courage to come forward and talk about things that had happened to them. And the idea of doing a story about 3 or 4 generations of women from the same family and these secrets that they've kept at various points in their life, and how society had shamed them at various points in history, really. And the way that, yes, society changes and things move on, but there's always something new that they can sort of be held against them. And that just became really fascinating to me. So I came up with the idea of the story for the family. So Betty is the great grandmother of the family, and she's got a daughter, Irene, and a granddaughter, Nicola, who has 2 girls herself, Ruby and Maisie. So perhaps if I read you a brief extract from the novel first, and then I'll talk a little bit more about the process of writing it. So I'll read first of all the prologue that comes, which I wanted to address this theme of shame, which runs really strongly throughout the book. It was the shame, you see, the shame I brought on my family. Sometimes it is easier not to believe than to accept something so awful could happen. That is why people bury things far beneath the surface, deep down, out of sight, out of mind. Though not out of my mind. I carry the shame with me always, the shame and the guilt. They do not go away. If anything, they weigh heavier on me now than they did back then, dragging me down, clawing at my insides. And when people say that what's buried in the past should stay there, they mean they don't want to have to deal with it. They're scared of the power of secrets to destroy lives. But keeping secrets can destroy you from the inside. Believe me, I know. And even the best kept secrets have a habit of forcing their way to the surface. And then I'll just read an extract from the first chapter. And at this point, Nicola, the granddaughter, has been staying with her grandma, Betty. She knows that she's very near the end. She's just popped out of the room to phone her mother, Irene, and let her know that the time is coming. And she goes back into the room. For a second, I thought she'd gone while I'd been on the phone, but her chest was still rising and falling. I sat down next to her and put my head in my hands. I'd been sitting there for quite some time, maybe 20 minutes or so, before I heard her voice. There are babies. I looked up. I hadn't expected to hear another word out of her. I took her hand again. Her eyelids flicked open. Babies? Where? I asked. At the bottom of garden. I frowned at her. She'd been coherent all the way through. Maybe this was a sign that she was at the end now. Then something clicked and I realised what she was talking about. No, Grandma, fairies, I said. You've got fairy statues at the bottom of the garden. The ones I used to dance around when I was little. There wasn't a pause on her part. Not fairies, babies, she said firmly. Look after my babies for me. What do you mean? I asked. What babies? It was too late. Her eyes shut again, and a second later she was gone. It was as if those words had taken the last breath out of her. I felt for a pulse just to be sure, but there was nothing. I screwed up my eyes and let my head drop, feeling the tears coming, but wanting to stave them off and gather myself, aware that I was the responsible adult in the house now, no longer the little girl dancing around the fairy statues in the garden while Grandma cooked tea for me. I gulped as the tears arrived in a rush, a life snuffed out, the memories, experiences and stories gone with her. Our family reduced to 3 generations, not 4. And all I could think of as I sat there and sobbed was the last thing she told me. I had no idea what she meant. Maybe she hadn't been with it. Perhaps she'd even been dreaming. She might not have been talking to me at all. But she had sounded so certain of what she had said and what she had asked me to do. So I will leave that there on a cliffhanger for you all. When I start thinking about a book and I have that original idea about the generations, writers tend to fall into 2 camps. There are the plotters and planners, and there are those that do the fly by the seat of your pants. And I'm firmly in the first camp, I have to say. I think partly from my experience of writing that first unpublished novel, when I felt I rewrote it for England afterwards. So I like to put in a lot of work beforehand so that I know that when I set off, I'm on the right path. So the first thing I wanted to do was come up with my characters. So I actually devised a family tree for Betty and her family and worked out the years. So I had some sense of when all the women would have been growing up and what was going on in the world at the time to give that sort of timeline to it. And one thing I do with my characters, which is quite unusual, I don't think I've come across anyone that does this, but I actually have a picture board of them, which I have next to my computer. So I have a whole stash of photos of people, that unknown people that I cut out of magazines, catalogues, anywhere I can find them, print them off from online. And when I've got the ideas for the characters in my head, I just go through all the photos to try and find what I think they look like. So this is the character board for my novel. So we have Betty down here, daughter Irene, granddaughter Nicola, husband James, Maisie and Ruby, and John, who's in the story as well. And that stays on my wall, basically, for the entire time I'm writing the novel. And it just makes them feel utterly real and alive to me. They're the first things when I sit down to write in the morning, I must say good morning to them, that they're there. And the very last thing I do when I finally finish a novel, finally finish the copy edits and the final press send for the last time, and it's gone to the printers, is to take those pictures down from my wall and then start to think about the next novel and then come up with the next cast for my novel. I also interview them, so all my characters, which again maybe goes back to my journalism background, but I do the sort of interviews, questions you get in the G2 supplement in The Guardian on a Saturday, so sort of an on the psychiatrist's couch type thing. So I will ask them what keeps them awake at night, what your epitaph would be, who would you most like to say sorry to and why? Those sorts of questions which really go beneath the surface. And it's only when I feel I know the answers to those questions that I feel ready to move forward, because I want to really know my characters before I start writing and to have a sense of how they will react in any given situation, because I feel I know their entire backstory. You know, I also plot that out, so I've got some idea of everything from where they went to school, who they grow up with, what they like to eat, all sorts of things. And then I actually take the very first thing I write generally is the blurb on the back cover, which again I think is something unusual, but I like to be able to do that. And I think, well, I need to be able to sell this story essentially to my agent and my publishers, but also to readers in a bookshop. And I like to think that I need to know how that would work on the back cover of the book before I start writing it. I completely understand that a lot of authors wouldn't dream of doing that, and that would be a very alien process, but that's just the way it works for me. And then I essentially expand that blurb into a synopsis for the novel. And then from there, I expand it further into a rough outline, then chapter plans, to the point where I actually have, for each chapter, I will have 2 or 3 scenes down for each chapter. Now, I know some people say, oh, doesn't that stifle your creativity if you've got all of that? My answer is I actually find it works the other way for me. It frees me up to write that chapter, because I know that I'm not going off on a tangent. I know the blueprint for the novel. And when I sit down to write the first chapter, I'm essentially not writing 100,000 words. I'm writing a chapter in which there are 3 scenes. I introduce these 2 characters, X and Y need to happen, and that's all I need to think about. And I find that really helpful to me in the process. I'll also do in these early stages any research that needs doing. So that varies with each book hugely, the amount and the type of research necessary. For this novel, there's a series of flashback chapters which go back, which are set in North Yorkshire during the Second World War. And that was something I perhaps hadn't anticipated at the beginning, that would need quite a bit of research along the way. So I did the thing of going to my local library. I live in Bingley now, not too far away, and got out lots of books on the Land Army and World War II Yorkshire, what it was like to be here in World War II, and did my research that way. And very often it will just be the sort of little nuggets that will bring hopefully the story to life that you will pick out from that research. But the groundwork is there so you feel that you're going to portray it accurately. And then set off on the writing journey, which for me, usually that first draft will be somewhere in the region of 6 to 8 months to write. And then at that point, it will go to my editor and agent. They will give me some feedback and notes and edit notes, and I will do revisions to it. And when everybody's happy with it, hopefully, it's then ready to go, and it then goes through a copy editor, and we have final proof pages. So the whole process takes somewhere sort of usually just over 12 to 14 months to do. But yes, fortunately, the good thing is that I love every stage of it. I know some authors don't like writing a synopsis or doing the edits at the end, but I actually enjoy all of it. You know, I love that whole thing of crafting the novel from the start to the finish. And I just find it hugely rewarding. But without doubt, the best bit then is the point where it comes out and readers hopefully respond to it. And the great thing with social media these days is that you hear back from people about, you know, how it made them feel. And that's just, you know, the absolute perfect way to finish the process, really, is to get that feedback. I suppose it's the nearest equivalent we've got of authors of being in a theatre and hearing people clap at the end. And when you get those responses from readers, it makes everything worthwhile. So yeah, that's my process really, and how I went about writing this book.
Gosh, that was really fascinating. I'm going to have to read it now, definitely. It's going to come to the top of my list.
Oh, that's good to hear. I haven't put any spoilers in there, so yeah.
Fascinating. What has been the response to it? Because I think it sort of touches on a lot of things, especially like you said, coming up recently. Yes. And a lot more people are interested in their ancestry and their family trees as well, more than they used to be with more access to the internet. So I wondered, you know, what has the response been?
Yeah, it's been really moving, actually, because a lot of people have got in touch with me with their personal stories. A huge number of women talked about either the secrets that they kept or that their mother or grandmother kept similar, and that they've perhaps found out very late in life, and sadly sometimes even after they died, they've found out things. And also I've had other women that have come out and told me about, I talked about the sort of Me Too movement and, you know, the history of women who have been sexually abused or or raped or harassed. And I've had women come to, reply to me with their stories about that as well. And, I think the biggest accolade you can feel as a writer is when someone who's been through those sorts of things for themselves has said that they felt it was an accurate and a sensitive portrayal of a subject, because that is all you can ask for, really. But it's been incredibly moving to hear people's stories, and it's sad on lots of levels that so many of these women have suffered in real life, as the things that my characters have gone through. But it's amazing and empowering to see and hear their strength of how they've come through things and how they've tried to change things for the better for the future generations. And that has been really inspiring.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's really positive, really, isn't it?
Yeah.
What I found interesting was how you sort of built your characters. I loved that you visually you needed to see what they looked like. And it was interesting how you talked about when you were a journalist, you'd interview them, so you get like a little snippet of someone, of their life. Is that something you've always wanted to do, is actually kind of grow that person to try and understand, human nature, how we all function?
I think there's a lot of that in there. And, it's one of the aspects of journalism that I do still miss is actually interviewing people, because I say the wonderful thing about it is that you would get to interview people from all walks of life, and people often would say, "Oh, have you interviewed anyone famous or whatever?" But the absolutely most interesting and fascinating people I ever interviewed were not famous. They were what we would call ordinary people, but they'd lived extraordinary lives. And I think as authors, it's those sort of stories and those characters that you want in your books. These are the sort of characters. So I think that's why it's so important for me that those characters are really well developed and come through. And it's something I feel as a reader, that I have to be really invested in characters. And if I don't feel I know the characters, or I don't feel any emotional bond with them, I find it quite hard. And I don't want my readers to feel that. So to me, that's sort of the work I put in at the beginning to hopefully make sure that readers feel connected to those characters. But I love bringing them to life, and it does make them feel entirely real. And there is a real sense of sadness at the end of a book when you essentially have to say goodbye to them, and then create a whole new set of characters, and they are all out there living in the world to me. I kind of sometimes, and during lockdown, I sometimes think about what they would have been doing themselves. And I actually went back, my latest novel, One Moment, which came out just before 2 weeks before lockdown. I actually went back to that during that time and wrote letters from the two main characters to each other, telling each other what they were doing, because I just felt that I was thinking about it, and I thought, well, hopefully readers would be thinking about it too, and I wanted to revisit them and think about how they'd be dealing with it all.
Do they ever surprise you, characters, as you're going along writing a book? Is it all planned, or do they actually?
No, they do sometimes surprise you. And I think, what I like to do, although I do all this plotting and planning, what I hopefully like to do is to keep things open for things to develop and for my characters to surprise me slightly. And for example, when I was writing this novel, there's a 10-year-old boy called Finn, who is one of the two points of view characters in it. And he's a quirky lad who is bullied mercilessly at school. He's not like the other boys. His passion is gardening. His idol is Alan Titchmarsh. So as you can imagine, he has a hard time at school. And his only friend there is a girl called Lottie. And I think in my first, the original chapter plan, she was, it was quite a small role, and she was there in a few. And as I wrote her, I got more and more completely fell in love with her as a character. And she just seemed to take on a life of her own. And she kind of forced her way into a few extra scenes and chapters that she wasn't supposed to be in.
That's brilliant.
And even then, when I sent the book to my editor, one of the first things she come back with was, "I love Lottie, can we see a bit more of her?" At which point she was allowed into even more chapters. So it's nice to keep that open, and to, as you say, sometimes be surprised or find a character really taking on an importance perhaps that you hadn't realised until you start writing the novel.
So is this new book, is One Moment, or the book that came after?
Yes.
Previous one. Is that sort of young, was that based around young people? Was that
it takes a 10-year-old boy called Finn and a 59-year-old woman called Kaz. So it's a very unlikely friendship, you may think, on the surface. And the book essentially starts just before they meet for the first time in a cafe where Kaz works. And what we don't know is that the second time they meet will be a moment which changes both of their lives forever and throws them together in a way which they have no idea of is to come. And the novel is told, I say, from both points of view, but also it alternates from that first time they met, so before the thing that changes everything, and then the chapters after the thing. So we gradually piece together what it is that's happened, but you don't find out exactly until the end of the novel, which hopefully keeps readers on their toes. I kept me on my toes writing it, certainly. But it's very much, and it was strange, really, I say it did come out a matter of days before lockdown, because it's a book which really is about finding friendships in the most unlikely places, and about the power and strength of a friendship between two strangers, and how that can become, the most important thing in both of their lives. And that sense of connection and connecting with someone, perhaps someone quite unlikely, I say, someone we'd never have thought we'd be involved with. That has resonated with a lot of people, interestingly, in the past year.
So where did the germ of that book come?
Again, there was one of those books where there were two elements to it. So with Finn, my son is 16 now. He's less than 2 weeks away from finishing school, but he had a really tough time at school. He was different, like Finn, but in a completely different way. I mean, one of the things I always make sure is that if the idea has come from real life, I have to change the character and the scenario completely so that it's entirely fictional. For my son, it was performing arts that he was passionately into from a very young age. And he had a shock of blonde curls, and he didn't look like or behave like the other boys. He's sensitive, he's creative, he hates football and no interest in sport. And he had a really tough time at school. And in primary school, he was bullied really badly for about 2.5 years, which we spent trying to, get the school on board, trying to get them to do something about it. And it was a really long process. And he's, in the last few years, really come into himself. He's a great secondary school locally, which have really supported him. And he's got a wonderful friendship group and all the things that you want school to be like. But there was a time when that wasn't the case at all. And for him at that point, he had a stable and supportive home life. And it made me think what that would be like to go through if the character didn't have that. So in the book, Finn's parents are in the process of going through a divorce, and they're very close to splitting up, and him having to split his time between them. And obviously that's really traumatic for him as well. So I just wanted to really, again, throw everything into poor Finn's world and have him having a really tough time. And with Kaz, her situation is that she's in a low-paid job in a cafe. She cares for her younger brother, Terry, who has schizophrenia and has been in and out of psychiatric units, quite a lot during his life. And she's essentially cared for Terry since he was about 10 years old because of circumstances at home. And at the time, again, we still are, unfortunately, hearing lots of stories about people, with mental health problems who weren't getting the support and the help that they needed, but also particularly with people who weren't getting benefits on time, having benefits stopped or reduced, having to go to food banks, and just that whole, the poverty and austerity that, we witnessed here and is ongoing. And I really wanted, I feel quite strongly that hasn't been portrayed enough in fiction. I think Ken Loach has done a great job in film of doing it with several of his films, but we really haven't seen that, particularly in commercial fiction at all. And I really felt that, if Dickens was alive today, that's what he'd be writing about, because, that would be the thing to write about. So I wanted to bring both of those issues together and have this boy struggling with the bullying and the broken home, and this older lady struggling to care for her younger brother, while financially they were both under huge pressure and just struggling to put food on the table. And to me, that was a really strong mixture to bring together, and to look at this thing about how we judge people in society and how we make opinions very much unfairly of, you know, why people might be in a situation. So often there's a story behind the headline, and that if we had any idea of what people have gone through and are continuing to go through, I think we'd feel very differently.
We would. That's the beauty of fiction, isn't it? You can explore these ideas in much more depth and give people, you know, fully rounded characters and reasons why they are where they are and who they are.
And interestingly, I think sometimes fiction is more powerful than journalism for that, because I think with journalism, you've got to get the story into the media in the first place, and that can be really, really hard. And B, I think people tend to come with it, depending on where the story is, you'll only reach a certain amount of the audience. Sometimes you're preaching to the converted. Sometimes people are not going to take any notice because they feel like they've got their views quite straight and they know how they feel. Whereas if you present it in a fictional way with fictional characters, it can really challenge people's views in a way which they find surprising. And again, with this book, I've had quite a lot of messages from readers saying this really made me reevaluate how I feel about people, particularly perhaps people on benefits or children who are being bullied, and it made me, you know, see the world through different eyes. And again, that's something as an author that I just think is so important that we do. You know, that's to me one of our most important roles, is to get people to look at the world through different eyes.
It is. So what's next?
The book I'm currently working on, which is set in Yorkshire in autumn 2019, which feels a world away now. You know, it's about sort of 6 months before lockdown happened. But at that point, all our world was about Brexit and everything that was going on then. Boris Johnson had a majority of one, having taken over from Theresa May. It was before he'd actually been himself elected. So it's a very different world. And it's essentially a modern day reworking of Romeo and Juliet, but set against a background of Brexit divided Britain. Wow. Because I couldn't help thinking about the division at the time that we were seeing in society. And, you know, in all parts of the country, and particularly hearing of people whose family had been divided, who, you know, had real splits in their family over this and real acrimony. And it did make me think about, you know, the story of Romeo and Juliet, and the idea of people coming from very different, supposedly different points of view, and that hatred for each other, but that actually, if you strip a lot of that back, there's a huge amount of similarity on both sides. So I've got two central characters, Sylvie, who is a French woman who has been living in this country for 20 years now, with her husband Bilal, who's French Moroccan, and they have two teenage children who were born and brought up, you know, in this country. And then the other family are the Cuthberts, I've got the Mastours and the Cuthberts instead of Montagues and Capulets. And they are a white working class family. The family's background is from a coal mining family in Yorkshire, very much the working class roots, and they voted very differently to the Mastours in the Brexit. And a teenager from each family meet at college in Leeds, and it takes the story of what happens then with their relationship and the impact on the families.
Brilliant. And when does that come out?
It won't be out until next year. I need to finish writing it this summer, and then it will be on the shelves next year. But I've loved writing. It's been a real challenge.
Yeah.
It's been great. My son's actually been studying Romeo and Juliet at GCSE English Lit while I've been writing the book. So we've helped each other out. We've been looking at the same book some of the times to try and make sure we've got everything covered. But yeah, it's been fascinating to write. I'm loving writing it and looking forward to sharing that with everyone next year.
Oh, it'll be brilliant. Yeah, we'll get you in, definitely.
Definitely, yeah, that would be great.
So lastly, what do you like to read?
Very varied list, yeah, is what I'd say. I'm going to tell you some things I've really enjoyed this year. I've just about finishing a book which I'm absolutely loved, which is called The Funny Thing About Norman Foreman by a debut author called Julietta Henderson. It's published by Penguin. I think it's out in hardback and audio at the moment. I'm listening to the audio, but paperback soon. And it is the funniest thing I've read this year, but also one of the most moving. And I think they would be, if you ask me, what do I like to read? I want to be moved emotionally, but I also like to be moved to laugh and smile, along the way. So, and that's about, a young boy called Norman Foreman. I love books narrated by a child. It's one of the things. So that's partly narrated by a child. 12-year-old boy who has lost his best friend, sadly. And they were a kind of a comedy double act, and they had this dream of appearing at Edinburgh Fringe. And they set off on a road trip from Cornwall to Edinburgh. And young Norman is going to appear on his own as a tribute to his friend who's passed away. And they have this amazing adventure with their mum and various people along the way. So that's fantastic. I do like psychological thrillers as well, but say particularly ones where I feel really engaged with the characters. I have to feel engaged with the characters. The Last Thing to Burn by Will Dean is another book which I've absolutely loved this year. Some people might have read, he's written some crime books before following the Detective Tuva along the way, but this is a standalone book. And it deals with the story of a woman who has basically come here, essentially ended up as a slave. It's about that sort of trade that happens with women coming here, and is now being held captive by the man who owns her to all intents and purposes, and her desperate attempts to escape from his home. Incredibly tense, incredibly moving as well. So that's been great. And the third book, I'll say one that I've loved this year is 100 I remember the name, 100 Things About Lenny and Margot. Which is another book, which is a different one about a teenage girl with cancer who is in the hospital, and through the art group in the hospital gets to meet an elderly lady who is also very much knocking on in life, but they start sharing these amazing stories of their life and painting pictures to bring them all together. And that, again, is really moving and really funny. So they're three very current ones that I've read. But, yeah, generally, real mixture going back to, I mean, my favourite novel is To Kill a Mockingbird, as it is, I think, for lots of people. I love Margaret Atwood. I love the John Boyne, Frederick Backman, Rachel Joyce. So a real mixture of authors. But I think the thing that links them all is that thing of stories and characters that move you along the way.
Oh, that's brilliant. Well, thank you ever so much. And I can't wait to read the last things you told me. And definitely get you in, because I think that would be brilliant, fantastic, as you're nearby. So all your books will be available in Bradford libraries. So get reading them, get them ordered, get them reserved. So thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. And please do support the libraries, everyone. You know, we have this amazing library service here in Bradford, as we have all over the country. And it's so lovely to have them back opening, and you being able to read all these wonderful books.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you.